The Iran-Contra affair. Known as one of the biggest scandals in US history, the Contras were a revolutionary group fighting against the communist Sandinistas. However, the US government eventually decided that they wanted to limit funding to the Contras, which they did by passing the Boland Amendment. The Boland Amendment prohibited the CIA, the Department of Defense, and other government agencies or entities that were involved in intelligence from using any funds whatsoever for the purpose of overthrowing the government of Nicaragua or providing a military exchange between Nicaragua and Honduras. However, instead of abiding by the Boland Amendment, Reagan administration officials disregarded the Boland Amendment and decided to take matters into their own hands by supporting the Contras. The Contra was a group that originated in Nicaragua. The leader of the group was Adolfo Calero, a businessman. He was the image for the Contra. Wanting to get rid of Marxist ways in Nicaragua, Adolfo studied outside of Nicaragua, but later returned. A few years later, he was incarcerated for opposing the dictator's opinions. After he went into hiding, the CIA later had a rebel group in which Calero said it was Crónicas de un Contra, which translates to Chronicles of a Contrast. Nicaragua during the Contra times in the 80s wasn't so great either. Nicaragua was facing a revolution during the 1960s. The revolution was to attempt to save a country from a dictatorship in the United States. The revolution did not fully end until the 1980s when the Sandinistas began to rule and successfully got away from the Somoza dictatorship and the United States. During this time, there was another crisis that emerged. The Iranian government held 7 Americans hostage in Lebanon. In order to bring them home, Reagan approved the controversial policy of exchanging arms for hostages. However, arms were not the only things that were exchanged. In fact, the administration was also willing to trade intelligence, money, medical supplies, prisoners held in Israel, promises to help free terrorists in Kuwait, and promises of a closer relationship with Iran in exchange for the hostages. This made the scandal even worse, as not only were arms being traded, but the administration was now deeply involved in international affairs and allying with terrorists. In doing this, Reagan violated the US arms embargo on Iran, as well as the administration's repeated pronouncements against making concessions to terrorists. Despite their efforts to keep the deal they made with Iran under wraps, it was eventually leaked, and an investigation by the US government ensued. Newspapers had mixed feelings about how Reagan dealt with the hostage crisis. The majority of newspapers published by the New York Times reacted negatively to how Reagan dealt with the crisis. One newspaper, published by the New York Times, mocked Reagan's behavior as he made a brief Oval Office speech about the hostage crisis and Iran. One of the ways was when he said that Mr. Reagan appeared somber during his 15-minute speech to justify Americans dealing with Iran. The same newspaper said that Mr. Reagan's speech, marked by an unusually defensive tone, depicted American contracts with Iran. In contrast, the Los Angeles Times had a more sympathetic tone toward Reagan and his decision-making with Iran. One article mentions that the Carter administration generally agreed that Reagan handled the Beirut situation as well as could be expected under the circumstances. In addition, the title of the newspaper is softer and more sympathetic towards Reagan's situation. However, the title on the New York Times article seemed more angry and sarcastic. I believe that our knowledge has increased significantly in this event in the past several decades. There have also been several interviews, articles, and even movies that have been made to discuss the Iran-Contra affair. One that was a very popular war movie was American Made with Hollywood star Tom Cruise. The movie highlights points about the CIA in the 1980s and hopes to expose the Iran-Contra affair. There are also interviews on former President Ronald Reagan addressing the situation on the Iran-Contra affair and how they had investigated the situation. This event is important because it shows us the executive branch of the United States government foregoing the checks and balances created by their own government by bypassing a law that prevented funding for an operation. As a result, the legislative branch, in order to accomplish their goal, as well as soliciting bribes from other third-party countries and running drugs in order to fund the Contras war in Nicaragua. This event is important due to the cover-up efforts former President Ronald Reagan's staff took in order to make sure that the event was altered for public eyes.